welcome to a sooner than expected episode of Look Out and Shout. Today we are reviewing Netflix Transformers War for Cybertron Earthrise. I thought I'd bring this episode forward, otherwise you would have all seen it and this would have quickly been old news. Now I'm going to say this a lot. This is going to be a full review of Earthrise, so there's going to be spoilers, many spoilers. I'm going to highlight some points I'd like to discuss. Not necessarily good points or bad points, but points I'd like to single out nonetheless. I'm then going to go through my negative points at the end, my positive points and my final verdict. But make sure you watch all of the video so you eagle-eyed people don't miss anything. So we start off with the Autobots just floating in space, and the Autobots themselves are kind of lying in stasis. We're not really given a reason as to why this is. Now, many Transformers fans will probably know from many other Transformers series, this is because typically the Autobots are low on power, they've got a long journey to do, so they go into stasis to conserve their energy. Okay, we can make that connection ourselves, but again, this wasn't explained to us really at any point throughout the show. And you think for the start of the series, they would have kind of given us some guidance for that. Double Dealer then appears with his ragtag band of misfits. It's not really the most glamorous introduction, and he doesn't get too big a part in the series in general, but still, it's nice to see him. I wasn't too familiar with the character from way back in the day, but this was a fairly okay introduction to the character. Speaking of mindless killing, there's mentions of the gladiatorial pits on Cybertron. Now, I was quite pleased to hear that, because it's not something that gets explored very often, and actually you hear that Megatron himself rose up through the ranks as a champion in the arena. Also, I remember from, I think back in old comic days, that he would fight, I think in his gold-chested form in the pits, and this is kind of his rise to power as fighting the oppression. Again, it was something very welcome to see. I also wondered, would they tie maybe Grimlock fighting in the pits as well, but clearly the Dinobots aren't in this. Shockwave going off script isn't too unfamiliar to us by now, although in Siege he was much more of a loyal lieutenant. Now, this Shockwave is much more cold. He's all about the logic. He even mentions that he's removed his emotions so he can just focus purely on logic. This has an IDW-inspired feel to him that he will happily go against Megatron's wishes if he feels he's on a better strategy. The Quintessons are introduced. Okay, that's fine. They start chopping off their own faces. That's weird. I'm very much on a mixed bag of this one. It was great to see the Quintessons. I had very high hopes for them. The fact that I always remember the Quintessons were one mind with 5 different faces to represent their thoughts and feelings, but the one character was the one individual. This came across as 5 separate individuals within one body, almost like a combiner struggling for control. And then to proceed to then chopping off all the other faces, being left with probably the lesser known face for most Transformers fans. I think that's the face of Rage, which would be appropriate. It didn't really work for the story, I don't think, and it was a strange move for a Quintesson to do. Megatron and Optimus have a bit of a heart-to-heart whilst Megatron's impaled. This again was a bit of a mixed bag for me. Whilst Megatron and Prime have had heart-to-hearts before, that's fine. This didn't feel like common ground had really been reached. I know they led on to teaming up against Scorponok afterwards, but again, this just felt a bit fractured, which was a bit of a shame. I did like that Optimus mentioned to Megatron, "You need me to fight your war, to fight your crusade. I need to be your villain." And this was something that you don't hear very often. It does make sense. Megatron is doing a rise for power and is rallying the Cybertronian citizens to fight against the Autobots, and Optimus needs to be their poster boy, the one that they're all fighting against. It was interesting to hear them mention that. Clearly this is done by design. Bumblebee is starting to become much more of an authoritarian. He's taking control, taking a leadership role, probably more so than Optimus is. And it was only a matter of time. Guess who tried to overthrow Megatron for leader of the Decepticons? No, it's not Soundwave. No, it's not. Galvatron being introduced probably gives more questions than answers. It was very good to see him. I did kind of felt his animation was a little bit rushed. I love the opening sequence, which looked just like he was being born out of the 1986 movie. I thought that was wonderful. His inclusion was somewhat brief in the grand scheme of things, but I'm sure we haven't seen the last of him. Speaking of brief, did anyone catch Unicron? You'd be forgiven for missing him. He was on screen for a very short amount of time. Clearly this is going to play out towards the end of the series. Galvatron has the golden disc. Again, welcome to see, but this raises more questions than answers yet again. Very brief inclusion of Nemesis Prime, just enough to sell a toy. I want to give a special mention to Cog. He's kind of the hero of this series. A bit of a no one, a bit of a faceless, a bit of a clone, you could say, but he actually comes through as a hero and sadly dies for his efforts. Okay, there were some discussion topics. Let's go through the negative points. We'll start off with the point that everyone seems to agree on, and that is the portrayal of Optimus Prime. Now, this is a character who's very strong to my heart, and very strong to a lot of people's heart. It hasn't really been executed well from Siege into Earthrise. I'm not believing the voice actor, I'm not believing the speech pattern, I'm not believing the actions. The voice actor I can almost take or leave, but is obviously trying very hard to sound like Peter Cullen. That's clearly the instruction that's been given. Sound as close to Peter Cullen as possible. The script writing, I don't buy him as a leader. As I mentioned before, Bumblebee comes across more as a leader than Optimus is. Optimus seems stricken with grief, or obviously there's conflict into the character. He's getting broody, or moody I should say, and there is this kind of divide of the character. I don't agree with the way he's always shouting. There's far too much shouting for Optimus. He's supposed to be the calm, the strong, silent type, the heroic one you fight behind, not someone who goes rah, rah, every 5 minutes. And that kind of leads on to my next point of voice acting in general. It wasn't fantastic in Siege, and it hasn't been particularly fantastic here. Now, you can't get the same characters and the same voices forever. We can't always demand that Ironhide sounds like someone from Texas, but they do become synonymous to a character and the portrayal of the character. Now, a good example of this is the voice acting for Prowl and the voice acting for Ironhide. They should be switched. They would work so much better if they were just switched. Nothing particularly wrong with the voices themselves, they're just aligned to the wrong character. Soundwave doesn't sound like Soundwave. Okay, I'm a bit of a traditionalist for that one. The only person who really stands out as particularly good to me is Megatron or Wheeljack. And overall, the series felt a bit rushed. There are 6 episodes about 23 minutes long each. Now, that's not very long to tell a whole story and continuous story that's got to develop, but you want to try and get character development. There's a lot of sub-stories going on, and everything feels rushed. I don't think scenes last anything longer than maybe 2.5 minutes. And okay, you don't want to spend too long in one room, but there's got to be enough for growth that you've got to try and buy in and sink in and just breathe it all in. When it's all rushed, it could have done with more episodes. I think that would have been better. Maybe 2 more episodes to really stretch out some things and to give things like Elita's storyline a bit more life. That would be most welcome. I wasn't too impressed with the Ultra Magnus character, or for what remnants there are of him. He's just sitting on a table, his head, so Megatron's keeping it as a trophy, yet they've released a toy for him, and they're going to release a toy for him in Kingdom. I was almost of the thinking that he was going to be resurrected somehow. That felt a bit of a waste to me. You know, you killed off a fairly major character and we just got ahead for maybe 1 episode. That was a waste. Now this ties into this point as well. We haven't seen any Earthrise modes. Now this is a bit cheeky when you think about it. We've got a whole new toy line with Earthrise modes, Earthrise truck modes, Earth-looking jets, and Earthrise Soundwave, in Earth form, and we haven't seen this represented in the Earthrise series. It's a bit like you've released all these toys and we haven't seen them on screen. Are you planning on putting these on screen? Possibly the worst point of the series, Optimus holding a gun to Megatron when there's a big hole in the side of the ship and says, "No, forgive me." He's asking for forgiveness of his mortal enemy so he can then get the forgiveness and shoot him. That made no sense. It was very, very badly written. I don't say that lightly. I don't like to say that either. But you read it back, you recite it back, and you think, why were you even doing that? Why would Optimus do that to Megatron? Why would anyone do that to their nemesis? It's a very, very badly done scene. And we'll finish off with Astro Train, because I don't know how long he was on screen for. I'd love to know what the total amount of seconds, yes, seconds, that he's actually been on TV in Siege and Earthrise. We see the tiniest glimpse of him, and it's just like, oh yeah, remember, you can buy a figure of this toy you barely see. Haven't seen him transform yet. Look, I know it's there to sell toys, I'm not naive, but wow, that was brief. Very, very brief. Okay, that's the negative points out of the way, let's get on with the good stuff. The amount of Easter eggs we got in this series for G1 and Beast Wars was brilliant. We got lines like I Still Function, you've got mentions of the Golden Disc. I thought it was great to have this fan service dropped in, even things like naming Char. What are the chances that we're going to hear of Char? That's a Decepticon planet, if anyone's wondering. It was great to see. I was quite pleased to get so many references, particularly in 6 episodes. Scorponok's introduction into the series I thought was really well done, and it led to a very good action scene as well. I love the fact that you heard this noise trundling around the ship and then this big scorpion comes into view. It's a great introduction to a toy and a character. This series felt a lot smoother as well. Whether that's down to the writing or the animation, or perhaps both, I don't know. But it did feel much smoother compared to Siege. I actually re-watched Siege just before Earthrise started, and you can tell the noticeable difference between the two. There is this kind of mention that you can watch it in 1.25 times speed, 1.25 speed, and I'd watched a bit of it. Some scenes move better, and clearly for the slower speaking bots like an Optimus or even a Megatron, that might help. But when you come to a scene with, say, Elita 1 talking, who's not exactly known for a slow speech pattern, she just sounds a little bit like she's on helium. But, you know, you can try it, see what you think. It's a small point, but one I wanted to bring up. We get a mention of Orion Pax Optimus without the Matrix. It was a nice touch. The Matrix seemed to take more of a centre stage in this series, more so than the Allspark does. And I'm quite glad of that. I'm much more about the Matrix than I am about the Allspark, and it shows its power, particularly when it's within Optimus. Having 2 concurrent stories really worked, because it gave us time to look about what's going on Cybertron, with Elita 1 leading her resistance group against Megatron and later Shockwave. This gave a bit more development, because if you think back to the G1 cartoon, once the Autobots and Decepticons crashed on Earth, we barely saw Cybertron again. We got glimpses of Shockwave, but that was about it. This gave a bit more time as to what's going on the planet that they've left. Definitely for me, the best character development of the series is Megatron. We see a lot more depth to the character here, as I mentioned before. He's more than just a mindless killer. This even ties into an IDW style Megatron, where there is a conscience, there is this constant fighting within. There is a deepness to the character, and there should be, for the leader of the Decepticons, not just to wage war or rule with an iron fist. It's someone who's trying to do right, at least in his mind, by peace through tyranny, if you like. I like that we saw so much development in the one character. And we touched on it before, the Skylink's introduction again worked quite well for me. I was pleasantly surprised to see the character. Didn't particularly sound like how I thought he would, and he maybe wasn't as egotistical as I would have liked. I did like the fact that he wanted the Matrix, he wanted to lead the Autobots, I guess. I thought that was quite a bold move for someone such as him. But the fact he was then banished to the dead universe was very, very good. Now, I have heard other people mention that this could have been anyone in a dead universe when he gives Prime his pep talk. That's a very valid point. But the fact that it was Skylinks, I like the Skylinks character, and the fact it was a dead universe as well, I thought that was quite good. But it could have been anyone. It could have been an Alpha Trion, it could have been an Ultra Magnus, it could even have been a Nova Prime. And finally, the ending. I quite like the ending. Okay, ships crashing is nothing new, but the fact that it just gave that glimmer of Beast Wars, and in particular Dinobot. Dinobot is one of my favourite characters. It was just really well done. You knew what's going to come. When you got to the end of Siege, there's a clip of them floating in space, and I think something's come up on radar. Clearly they're talking about Double Dealer and the Mercenaries, we know that now, but when we watched it back then, we didn't really know what that was leading to. At least at this point, we know what this is leading to with Kingdom, and we're excited for it. I certainly am. It looks like Kingdom will appear in May this year, and will wrap up the War for Cybertron series. It certainly hasn't been perfect, but I will be sad when it's done. And finally, my verdict. I give it 3.5 Rodimus Star Badges out of 5. I initially viewed it a bit higher, but I have heard other reviewers with their views, and it's made me change my views just a little bit. But anyway, that's it. What did you think about it? Leave a comment, I'd love to hear from you. Well, thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, share and subscribe. I'll see you on the next one.